Thank you. Thank you, Kuyen. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in this PEMNA meeting. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. As Kuyen was saying, what I want to do this morning with you is to explore how to adapt the fiscal decentralization systems that the countries have to help combat climate change. And so the outline of the presentation is first I will start with some motivation. What's the role of some national governments? What role can they play in the national strategy to fight climate change? And second, then what's the conceptual framework that we could depart from? And what I will argue is that we will need to look at all the pillars of fiscal decentralization, which is expenditure assignment, the revenue assignments, the sources of revenue, the transfer system, as well as some national borrowing. Then I will have some final concluding thoughts. Let me start with the motivation first. My point and other people's points is that a stronger and closer intergovernmental coordinated approach is needed to fight climate change. But often, the proposed approaches, the national strategies that one sees is that they are based only on sectoral policies regarding energy generation, transport sectors, etc. But this is probably quite incomplete because these strategies do not specify what level of government is going to be in charge of regulating and implementing these policies and how all these policies are going to be financed. Let me just go back to the Nick Stern report of 2007, which concludes that over 40% of greenhouse gas emissions come from activities like transport, land use, buildings, waste management, etc., for which subnational governments, provinces, regions, municipalities, local governments have and exert regulatory, financing, and taxing powers. So the part of the answer has to be then that how can the existing institutional fiscal decentralization frameworks how can they be adapted to support the national strategies? Getting the functional assignments of responsibilities right will offer a question of who's in charge of regulation and implementation. And getting the other three pillars of decentralization right, revenues, transfers, borrowing, will allow to answer how we're going to finance that. What are the advantages of adapting fiscal decentralization to fight climate change? We know that the decentralized approaches can cater to geographical differences in needs and have better access and information, and also provide a laboratory for innovations and what we typically call a race to the top, where subnational units, regions, provinces compete with each other for better outcomes. However, it's quite clear that the presence of large externalities and economies of scale, as Kuyen was just saying, also demand an important role for national governments. Mind you that there are not all advantages. There can be also disadvantages. We know that decentralized systems can be sometimes a hindrance to effectiveness and to fighting climate change. For example, some national governments can compete with each other in a race to the bottom to attract businesses by relaxing environmental standards or trying to free ride on neighbors. Let them do the clean things and we are going to pollute the air. Um, Overall, when we look at the international experience and practices, we're going to see that there are good international practices to engage some national governments in fighting climate change. They are available. However, and this is a big important message, many countries around the world still have to effectively engage their some national governments in their overall climate change strategy and policy developments. So has your country engaged some national governments? Are you working on it? Let's think about it. So what is the conceptual framework? Well, it's quite simply is how to adapt the four pillars of fiscal decentralization: expenditure assignments, revenue assignments, transfers, and borrowing, to support countries' pledges to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and also other pledges, such as non-fossil fuel energy, renewable resources, and so on. So it's quite, without doubt, that some national governments, the second and third tier of government, can be supportive of climate change. However, there are two important challenges that we need to keep in mind going forward. One is that institutional fiscal decentralization reform is often slow and arduous to implement. We know that how long has it taken to some countries, many countries, to actually implement those decentralization reforms. And also that when we're thinking about adapting the existing fiscal decentralization framework to combat climate change, we have to keep in mind that often we have problems with some of those pillars of fiscal decentralization. There might be the wrong assignment of responsibilities, there might be too little revenue autonomy, and so on. So let's start with the first pillar of adapting expenditure responsibilities. Here, the theory is quite simple because we can use what we know as the correspondence principle. Depending on the size of the externalities that we're looking at, the activity that is polluting air, whatever, there might be local, regional, or national externalities. So the correspondence principle says, well, that should be then the responsibility of national, or regional, or local. And typically, we always claim that exclusive responsibilities is the best approach to it. However, I'm going to argue that in the case of climate change, concurrent responsibilities are the best way to organize this strategy. Mind you, that there are some constraints to keep in mind. I mean, some national governments have to have the capacity to plan, monitor, and sanction. And they have to have access to data and all other relevant information if they're going to be using green taxes or regulating activities. And they have to have the funding and the financing for those responsibilities that are given. But how should we organize this intergovernmental coordination? Well, when we look at the international experience, what we see is three main approaches to expenditure assignments. We have what we can call a centralized model. The best example that comes to mind is China, where climate-related standards and economic-wide targets are exclusively centrally mandated and determined. In the middle, There is what we call a concurrent model that is used in countries like India or Germany, Colombia, where both central and subnational governments contribute to the determination of climate-related standards and economic-wide targets. And the approach here, what's interesting about this approach is that the national standards provide a floor. Everybody has to comply with that, but it encourages and promotes a run to the top by having the subnational governments outperform each other. Finally, there is what we can call a decentralized model used in countries like Brazil, Canada, or the United States, where the states or the provinces are given most of the authority to setting standards and regulations. Overall, I claim, and we can argue more about it, is that the concurrent model is probably the best way to go forward with this. The second pillar of decentralization is revenue assignments. And here, of course, we have to give the central authority, the central governments have that authority, but we also have to provide subnational governments with revenue authority to penalize or reward actions by businesses and households, and in the process of affecting the behavior of those polluters, then also claim what we can call a double dividend, which is collect revenues that can be reinvested in fighting climate change. The theory, again, simple. The practice is more complicated. The theory is that depending on, the types of externalities, the authority should be local, regional, or national. Mind you, that the important thing with green taxation is not to collect revenues. Here we are not in the business of the regular, usual business of government, of tax administrations and tax policy, which is to collect revenues efficiently. Here, the purpose is to affect behavior, to change behavior, to penalize activities that affect climate change. But nevertheless, in taxing these activities, then we raise a double dividend in the sense that we can diminish those polluting activities, but we also can collect more revenues. Revenues that then can be used to feed back into the climate change strategy. There are many other ways to approach this. One possibility, for example, is to have some national taxes that piggyback on national taxes. For example, a carbon tax, national carbon tax, that then can be piggybacked by regional or provincial governments. Now, when we're talking about some national taxes, green taxes, we need to keep in mind that there are some important concerns that to have in our objective, because there's the potential high mobility of some national tax bases. One province can tax this activity, well, everything shifts to the other province. It's like a water balloon that it goes from one place to another. We also need to have capacity, so national governments have to be able to measure polluting activities, etc. And there is also a need for central governments to provide that revenue authority to local and regional governments. Now, when we look at the international arena, the replication of good international practices is still quite small. Even in OECD countries, only about 5% of revenues are from green taxes. So there's a long way to go. And nevertheless, there is not a lack of good instruments that can be used. to implement some national taxes on electricity, on transport, on plastic, the use of plastics, on taxing CO2 emissions, implementing cap and trade markets, or using different sorts of environmental charges. Some of them as fee-based, which has a sliding scale of fees and subsidies depending on the level of activity. Okay. This is what Kuyen was talking about. Adrian Fossard talked to you about it, which is the use of intergovernmental grants or transfers. This is without doubt the most versatile and adaptable instrument to get some national governments involved in climate change strategy. Conditional grants are used for recurring and capital purposes and can have ex ante or ex post conditions. For example, conditional transfers can be used to compensate some national governments for internalizing different types of externalities, to incentivize different conservation activities, to promote energy efficiency, or to introduce land use restrictions to prevent flooding damages. When we look at international experience, there is still a lot to be done. But there are interesting practices. For example, conditional grants are being used for forest conservation in Brazil as ecological transfers, or in Portugal the same. Or you have countries like Australia and the United Kingdom using contracts or performance-based contracts and grants to have some national governments undertake the fix or determine climate services. Other possibilities without developing much of new instruments is to re-examine existing conditional grants for the potential embedding of green practices, with doing that without disturbing the desirable fundamental goals of each grant. For example, we might have a grant for transportation, but can we embed in that grant for transportation the use of energy efficiency in transport, or the same for buildings or water and sewage services and so on? The last pillar of fiscal decentralization is borrowing. And I think all of you know that this can be controversial, but there is no question that borrowing is desirable from both efficiency and equity perspectives. Nevertheless, borrowing has to be prudential, has to be careful, because it can carry potential threats to macroeconomic stability in any country. Without borrowing, it's going to be very hard to see how a lot of this adaptation policy programs, adaptation projects for avoiding the bad consequences of climate change are going to be undertaken. Borrowing is going to be needed. There is a growing practice internationally with, for example, with green bonds, which are a fixed income instrument as any bond, but where the funds are earmarked for climate change investment projects, so they have to be certified for that use, and they offer tax advantages, so it's more attractive to investors. Green bonds are being used increasingly, but still there's a way to go. But always a word of caution with any promoting borrowing by some national governments. We have to look at fiscal responsibility laws. We have to look at prudential debt limits, and we have to make sure that some national government fiscal discipline is enforced. In conclusion, then, getting policies to fight climate change right will require a great deal of dialogue, coordination, and planning between central governments and some national governments. I think the best place to start with this is to work together, commonly, the dialogue, open dialogue. So to have an explicit view and program view of the role of some national governments in the national strategy for climate change. Let's go back and review those national strategies for climate change. What are the roles that some national governments are being assigned? What can be improved? What can be expanded on the basis of this basic framework that we're talking about? On this approach, I have argued in this presentation that the best way to go is to use a concurrent responsibility approach. Have national standards that provide a button, so we don't have, one region exploiting the rest of the country, abusing or with unfair competition. We have a floor and minimum standard for the entire country, but then encouraging, incentivizing the particular regions, provinces, local governments to run to the top, to do better, to improve, and to compete with each other on performing better. In order to finance these activities, we have to look at the feasibility of introducing green taxes at the national government, and also the green transfers that we have been talking about, as well as green bonds. And so what does that will be needed going forward? Well, we have to look at how to augment the capacities of national governments to help design and implement these policies. So there might be a lot of capacity building, a lot of dialogue, a lot of training, and to improve coordination mechanisms and dialogue. And definitely what at the end of the day we can preach and advise, but what makes a big difference, we know, is to provide sharper financial incentives to motivate some national governments. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much for your attention.